In this tutorials, we are going to cover the following: folder creation, React installation with Vite, Tailwind CSS installation, and also clean up the template that comes along with these installations. Great. So now I will go ahead and cd into a folder that I have created. So I name my folder portfolio blog. Now I'll go ahead and install React with Vite. So you can use the following command: npm create Vite at latest. We are naming it frontend because we will have both frontend and a backend for these applications. Awesome. So now we have installed successfully the template. We will go ahead and cd into it. And next we will open this in our Visual Studio Code using the command code dot, which will open the current directory we are in. Now we will go and install the packages that came along with this template. So we will do that by running npm install. Next, we will be installing the Tailwind packages. We will be using the post CSS and auto prefixer. Next, we will run the following command to initialize the Tailwind configurations. Running this command creates two main files: the Tailwind config and also the post CSS. These are very necessary for our production, and we will be utilizing mostly the Tailwind config. Now, let's navigate into our Tailwind config to make some modifications. First, we will add some content into the content array. In here, we'll be adding the following file extensions. So we will mainly be using HTML, JS, and JSX. I also added the TypeScript just in case in future you want to migrate this project to use TypeScript. The next thing we will do is to add some custom theme. I'll mainly be adding the screen and also the colors. For the screen, we will be using mostly the small, medium, and large. I also added the extra large for some configurations that we will need it for. And lastly, we have the colors. All this will be attached to the resources in this lecture. We will go into our source, navigate to the index.css, and we will clear everything in this file. We will be using the base, component, and utilities that come along with Tailwind. Adding this command, the base, component, and utilities, will help us utilize some of the pre-styled classes that Tailwind has, so we don't have to write everything from scratch. Now let's go ahead and import this custom style from Google Fonts. I'm using the Poppins for this project. Now let's go ahead and remove the app.css. We will not be using this, so let's go ahead and delete this from our project. Alright, now let's go into the app.jsx. In here we will want to clean up because we are not using any of this code. So we will remove all the imports. And next we will clean up the main function. Let's go ahead and write hello world just to make sure our application is working when we run it. Now let's navigate to the main.jsx and make sure we have all the imports. Everything looks right here. So now we will go back to the assets. In here we will delete the react.svg because we don't need it. And I'll go ahead and add some assets that we will need for this project. Again, this will be part of the resources attached to this video. We will mainly be needing the blogs, assets, projects, resume, and also some assets for hero section, logo, and other parts of our application. Awesome. So now let's go ahead and run our application by running the following command: npm run dev in our terminal. Let's go ahead and copy this URL. Now we will paste it into our browser, and here we have our hello world running nicely. So this will be it for this tutorials. The next video, we are going to work on the styling and also setting up our CSS. See you in the next video. In this lesson, we will be enhancing our project by adding common element styles using custom CSS and Tailwind. In this section, We are going to continue customizing the styles for our project. We have already set up the Google Fonts and Tailwind imports, so let's dive right into the custom styles. First, we will be defining the root. We have the primary and the secondary color. We will be applying these two colors to our scroll bar. We want to change the scroll bar style from width large to thin, and also change the color for the thumb and the background. Let's go ahead and apply these changes to WebKit-based browsers. This will apply the same style that we apply to Firefox to our WebKit-based browsers. Now, if we navigate back to our browser, we should see that our scroll bar has a background color of dark, and the scroll icon itself has a different shade of black, which is a bit brighter. Let's go ahead and add our common styles to header, body, and other elements. We are applying a background and a text color, padding, and smooth scrolling to our body HTML tag. In addition to that, we are also making sure our font family is Poppins, which we have already imported. Now let's go ahead and apply some styles to the headers. Let's save this and check the changes that this gives us in our browser. So now we can see our background is dark. Our scroll bar is now very prominent. We also have the style applied to the title, subtitle, header. We will go ahead and make the necessary changes for body and the two buttons. Here, we want to apply a text secondary color to our paragraph and also make the size responsive. In addition to that, we want no bullet for our list, and also we want our list to have a cursor pointer. We will be using the list mostly as a navigation item. Let's style the links and buttons. For our links, we do not want any text decoration. We also want to use the text secondary, and we want to use a cursor pointer. For button, we are applying some responsive text size. We also apply some padding, and we are making it a bit rounded. In addition to that, we want the background to be transparent because we will be applying some custom utility classes to our buttons. Now, if we go back into our browser, we can see the body has changed, but the primary buttons are still the same. Let's go ahead and continue adding the necessary styles. For our input and text area, we don't want it to have the default styling, so we are removing the outline. We also want the background to be transparent and also want the border button to be 0.7 pixels. We are also making sure the border color is white, and we are using text main as the main color. We want the width to be full, and on focus we want the color to be orange. Now we can see the change in our browser. When I click on it, we can see the bottom is now orange, highlighting that this is now inactive. And also we can notice there is no outline decoration to this. Lastly, we will go ahead and create a utility layer. The button primary class will give button a primary background, and on hover we want to change the primary background to be a border and the same as the text. For the secondary, by default we don't want any background color, but we apply the green color as the border, and on hover we want the background to be full. Let's go ahead and see the changes. So now on hover of primary, we can see the changes have been applied. Let's try the secondary button. We can see the secondary button also has the styles applied to it. In the next video, we are going to focus on building our navigation bar. Let's head right into the next video. In this section, we will implement the navigation component. In addition to this, we will ensure the responsiveness of the navigation bar on different screen sizes. Let's go ahead and get started. First, let's navigate to the source directory and create a new folder called Component. Next, we will create a shared folder within the components. Let's go ahead and add a new file in the shared folder and call it navbar. Inside this navbar, we will create a new component using the snippet name Ravsi. This is a plugin from VS Code that you can install. Let's go ahead and add a temporary text navigation to test this on our browser. In our app.jsx, we will import the navbar from components shared folder and render it before the route component. This is temporary and we will move this rendering to a different component later. Let's test this in our browser. Alright, we will navigate back to the navbar component and implement the navigation. We will first import the nav link and link from React Router DOM. We will use both elements to render the navigation items. Next, I will import some icons from React Icons library, which we will use in just a few seconds. I will be using the following icons: CG Girl, GI Journey, and Leah Blog. We will also use this as part of each navigation item for styling purposes. Let's go ahead and install the React Icons package now. Great. In the return value of our component, we will clean the temporary div we created and add a nav element as our wrapper. In this wrapper, we will go ahead and create a logo. We will use the link element from the React Router DOM and provide the property with path / which will route to our home page. Next, we will implement our menu item on ordered list element. Let's add our first li element and nav link item for the home page and test it on the browser. Now we will import a logo from our asset and replace the image source with it. Let's go ahead and test our changes in the browser. We will now add some styles to the nav items. We will use flex to make the items horizontal and occupy the space that we've provided. Next, we will change the weight of the logo to a smaller size. We will make it 24. Let's test this in the browser. And we have a smaller logo now. Alright, now we will go ahead and style the nav items. We will add a color and also make it inline so that it is linear with the item text. We will also give it a margin of 2 between it and the text. Let's make a fix so that the nav items are spaced out using the whole width, and we'll replace the space x8 with justify between. Now let's check if this works as expected. Moving on, we will make the list items a flex and display them in a row, and we will also have to space them out. Let's go ahead and duplicate the nav link items for our resume and blogs. We will also have to modify the icon and text colors. Let's test this in the browser to ensure everything is working as expected. As we can see, we have the 3 navigation items. Next, we will add a button called Let's Talk, which will route to the contact section. we will use the btn secondary as the class property. Let's go ahead and check it in our browser. Okay, we will also have to modify the path for resume and blogs to their respective path names. And if we go back to our browser, when we click on home page, we can see that it doesn't change. But when we click on resume, blogs, and contacts, and let's talk, we can see the URL changes. Also, when we click on the menu items, there is no style that tells us if it's active or not. We want to add some hover effect or an underline effect so that we know which link is active or which one we are currently touching. Let's go back to our code and implement this. So in the nav link element, we can pass the class name, and for the class name, we can destructure a property called isActive. We will use this to render the different classes that we will implement later. When the link is active, we will use the active link underline, and when it's not, we will want to use the hover. Let's go back to index.css and implement this. We will create a class called hover underline and apply inline block relative and give it a padding bottom of 2. We will also define a selector after, which we will use to create a custom underline. We are providing it with absolute, bottom 0, 50% of left, width 0, and we are also making the background secondary, which is the green color. We are also making the height 2 pixels and providing some linear animation. For the content, we don't want to pass anything. Next, we will go ahead and apply this to the hover. We will make the width full and give it a left 0 whenever we hover on it to apply the style. Lastly, we will implement our active link underline class. Similar to our hover underline, we will have an absolute position, but this time the bottom and left will be 0 and we will give the width full. We can go ahead and test this in the browser. Let's go ahead and pass the class name to our resume link and also our blogs link. Alright, now if we hover on resume, we can see the changes have been applied. And if we click on it, our URL changes as expected. Next, we would have to implement this for our mobile screen. Back in our Visual Studio Code, we will make this list appear only on larger screen, and that's why we will need to provide the medium before the flex. Next, we will provide the hidden by default, so on smaller screens, these items wouldn't show. We will do the same to our button. So we will give it hidden by default and make the display block whenever we are on medium or larger screens. If we go back into our browser, we will now notice that there is no list nor button. Let's go back and implement the navigation for our mobile screen. Since we do not want to replicate the same thing, we will go ahead and move this list into its own component. We will create a new component and call it nav items. This component will take a class name because that is the only property that differs between the web and mobile view. Let's go ahead and replace the class name with the property we are passing. Now we will clean up our code and use the new component we've created and pass the same class name we have previously. Lastly, we will go ahead and implement our mobile navigation. For the mobile navigation, first, let's create a container and provide it a display of blog and also hide it on larger screen. We will make the Z index 10 because we want it to be prominent regardless of wherever we are. Now we will also provide an onClick function. We want to toggle the menu whenever we click on this button. Next, we will implement this toggle menu. Before we do that, we will need to import useState from React, and we will use this to handle the state between open menu and closed menu. For our toggle menu, we will pass in the opposite of whatever the previous is open value was. So if it was false, now it will be true, and vice versa. Next, we will go ahead and use isOpen to render our icons. We will use the CI menu fries as our hamburger icon and the close outline as our close icon. Let's go ahead and import this. We can see that by default, our hamburger icon is showing, and when we click on it, it shows the close icon. Next, we will implement our navigation items. We will make a container, and in this container, we will provide the following class. We would want to give it a full height and also make the position fixed. We will give it a left of 0, top of 0, and make the width full so that it occupies the space on the screen. We are using a background black and giving it a pattern left and right 2, up and down 5. Also, we want to delay the opening of this, and we are making the items inside it also flex. Next, we would also want this to be hidden whenever the navigation is closed. So that's why we are providing it with a left value of -100%. When we go back to our browser, we can see whenever we click on the hamburger menu, it opens a slider from the left with a darker background. This is where we will be adding our navigation items. Let's go back into the code and add the navigation items. Inside this container, we will go ahead and call our nav item. We will pass the following class properties. We will make it flex. We also want the items to display in column, and we want to center the items. For spacing, we want to use justify between, and also make the text size for extra large. We would also want the padding left, right, bottom, and up to be 2. Let's go ahead and check the changes in our browser. As we can see, we have our navigation rendering correctly, and when we click on it, they work as expected. We will go back and add the button. So let's just copy the button we have for our web, and in here we will make some modifications. We will just remove the hidden and only provide it with a class of BTN secondary, and also give it a margin top of 3. In addition to that, we also want to make the display block. Alright, this will be all for our navigation items. In this section, we will implement the footer and social media icons components. First, I'll go into my components, shared, and there I'm going to create a new file called footer. Let's go ahead and add the footer implementation. I will use the RefC to instantiate a new component. Now, we will be implementing a very simple footer. Our footer should have just the description saying the all rights reserved, and also some social media links that we will add as a different component. So let's go ahead and create a footer tag. Inside this, I'm going to create a p tag in which I will put all the rights reserved. Now, let's go ahead and import a component that we will add in just a couple of seconds. The reason why we are creating this component in a different file is because we will also use it in our hero section. So it's always a good idea to isolate components if you know it's going to be reusable at some point. Now, I'll call this component. We will not be expecting any props. So let's save that and go back into our app. We will temporarily import this footer and see how it shows on the browser. Let's put this right after the route. We are having this error because we haven't created the social media links yet. So let's go ahead, go back into our folder structure and add a new file called social media links. Inside here, I will use my RAFC to also instantiate a new component. Now, if I reload the page, you can see the icons have been added on top, and then we have our copyright text down here. The next thing I'm going to do is to add some styles to this footer. So let's go ahead and define a class name. I'll give it flex. I'll also make it a flex column, and I'll center the items. Let's save that. So we can see it moved it right into the middle, which is what we want. Next, I'll give it a gap of 4, and I'll give it a margin bottom of 4. Lastly, let's go ahead and implement the social media links. So I'll navigate into this file, and in here, I'm going to import 4 icons we will need from the React icons library. So for my social media icons, I want to use the Twitter, Medium, GitHub, and LinkedIn. Feel free to use whatever link you would want on your personal website. Let's go ahead and implement this. So I will wrap this around a bracket, and let's remove these temporary social icons. Next, I'm going to create my first social icon, and I will be using the anchor tag. I'll pass in the href. I will also make the target a blank page so that it opens a new page. I will give it a rule of no opener, no referrer. What this will do is it will prevent the new page we open to have any connection with our current page. This is for security purpose, just to prevent some malicious activity happening to your website if the link we open is corrupted. Now, let's go ahead and give it a class name. For the style, we just want to give it a hover text secondary. I can go ahead and use one of the icons I imported. So let's use the GitHub. And I'll give it a size of 25. Let's save this. So as we can see, we have our GitHub icon there. When I hover on it, the color changes to text secondary. I'll go ahead and copy this for the rest of our icons. So in here, I'm going to change this to LinkedIn. I'll change this to Medium. And lastly, I'm going to change this to Twitter. The last thing we want is to make this appear in a row format. So I will go ahead and give it a class name and give the following styles. So I'll give it flex and give a gap of 4 between them. That will be it for this part. Next, we will implement the layout component. Let's go ahead and do that. In this section, we are going to create the layout component. In addition to that, we will also create a divider and a section layout. We will also add a component that will allow us to scroll to the top. Let's go ahead and implement these. First, inside the source folder, I'll go ahead and go into my shed, and I'll add a new file called layout. As usual, I will use my RAFC to instantiate a new component. Next, I will go ahead and import our navigation bar and our footer. We will render the navigation, and next we will also render the footer. In between, we want to render every child component. So for example, all the content we will have in our home page should be here. So with that, let's go ahead and pass a new prop and call it children. And we will simply render the children between the navigation bar and the footer. Let's go ahead and import this in our home page and see how this works. So I'll go back to the root. In here, I'm going to import layout. and now wrap this around a new component called layout. Let's save that, and as we can see, there is some replication. So we will go back into our app.jsx and remove the temporary rendering of the navbar and footer. So when we save that, we can see it's working as expected. So I'll go ahead and go into my routes and then do the same for our resume page. So we can just copy this and paste it right before the component. And we can do the same, just copy the return and modify this to resume page. We will also do the same for our blogs page. So go back to the route into the blogs folder. Let's start with the index and let's go ahead and import our layout. We will also add the return, and this is supposed to be from, you're supposed to add this because it's a folder. So let's go ahead and change this to blocks. And let's not forget to remove this. So now if I go to resume, we still have it. And if I go to blocks, it's still there. The last one is we are supposed to do this for our blog page. So I'll go ahead and paste the return since we've already copied it and put blog page. And now I'll go ahead and import the layout component. Alright, so that's it for wrapping all the components or pages with the layout. So we will go into the layout component and further add some styles. In our layouts, I'll give the container a class name and I will add the following styles. I'll give it a flex and also I'll give it a flex column because we want the navigation always on top, the children in the middle, and the footer at the bottom. So let's give it a flex column, and lastly, let's make it a screen height. So it should always take the maximum screen height. The next thing we would have to do is to go into our footer because you always want the footer to be at the bottom. And in order to achieve that, we will have to add a margin top of auto. When we save that, we can see the footer has now moved to the bottom. So now we will come back to our layout and continue with the implementation. We will add a divider. So let's go ahead and create a new function and let's call it divider. Also, let's export this as we will be using it in various places. In this divider, I'll simply return a div, and inside this div, I'll also create another div. And for the styles, I will give this a medium. Between medium and extra large screen, I want the margin on the horizontal to be 20, the vertical to also be 20. Now, I'll go ahead and give this the main line. So we want the divider to be some form of thin line. So I'll make the width full. I'll give it a height of 0.5 pixels. And I'll give it a background of gray. We can go ahead and put this right before the footer. So if I put the divider right before the footer and save it, we can see the divider is right here. Next, let's go ahead and implement a section layout that we'll be using throughout our pages. So I'll go ahead and export const section layout, and this will take a title, a subtitle, and children. So in here, I'm going to return a div, which will be our container. And the first thing I want to render is the divider. So before each section, we want to put some sort of dividers just to differentiate which side or section we are on the page. And next, I will create another div container. I will add an h2 element, and this is where I will render the title. Next, I will add a p tag, and in here, I'm going to render the subtitle. Lastly, right after these, I'll render the children. We will give it a class name. On medium or larger screens, we want the items to be centered. We also want to give it a margin bottom of 5. And also for medium screen, we want a margin bottom of 10. And also we want to give it on the left and right 40 for medium screen. For non-medium screens, we just want to give it a margin bottom of 5. And that will be all for this. Let's go ahead and wrap this whole thing around a divider. And in this container, I'll give it a class name and I'll give the following properties. So I'll make it flex and I will also want them to display in a flex column. I will justify the content to center, and on smaller screens, I want the items to be on the left side, but on medium or larger screens, I want the items to be centered. Let's save that. So if we go right between the navigation and divider, let's try and implement a section. So let's say I pass a title and I give it a subtitle. And for the children, I want to give it just a div. So as we can see, we have the title, the subtitle, and whatever the section will be. And we also have a divider right before it. So this is exactly the behavior we want. I'll go ahead and remove this as this was for testing purpose. Now, the last thing we would want to add is an ability for us to scroll to the top. So assuming we had a scrollable container or we have a lot of elements and we have scrolled all the way to the bottom, we want a way to go back to the top, and that's exactly what we are going to implement. So we'll go back to the shed and we will create a new component file called scroll to top. Let's use our RAFC to just create a temporary component. I'll go back to my layout, and in here, I'm going to import this component. We will render this component right before our footer. So let's go ahead and render this. Back in our scroll to top file, we will go ahead and add the implementation. So for this, we will be using an arrow from the React Icons library, and we will use the FA arrow circular. Let me go ahead and remove the temporary content and create a new divider. In here, I'm simply going to render the arrow that we just imported. And if I save it, you can see from our browser this changed to the arrow. We will go ahead and give this a class. We will make the text secondary. We will also make it cursor pointer. And lastly, when we hover on it, we want the text to be white. And let's save it. So by default, you can see it's secondary, and when I hover on it, the text changes. Also, let's give it a size of 50 and save it. And now it's a bit bigger. Lastly, we will also want to style the actual component. So for this component, we will give it a class name, and let's give it an empty object for now. We will go ahead and assume that we have created a hook called use scroll to top. From this hook, we will destructure and get show scroll and also scroll to top function. With the value we have here, we can now use this to implement when we want to show this icon. So let's use the string literals. By default, we want position to be fixed, we want bottom to be 0, and we want the right to be 10. If I save it, I will also give it a z index of 9. So when show scroll is true, we want to show this icon. If that's not the case, then we want it hidden. I'll go back into my folder structure. We are going to add a new folder called hooks. And in this folder, we are going to create our file scroll to top.js. Let me go ahead and fix this. So if I navigate, we can see that it has the correct file name. Inside this file, we will use effect, use state from React. And let's define the function itself. So what this function will do is, first, we will create a state, which will be a Boolean. So we will pass a default of false. We will also create a function called scroll to top. And this will be our return value. So we will return our show scroll and scroll to top. Let's go ahead and implement this. When you click on the scroll to top, we want to set the document body scroll top to be 0. And we also want to set document element scroll top to be 0. We will use effect to render this. First, let's go ahead and create a function. We will call this function scroll, and we will check if our document.body, so if the body element scroll top is above 20, or document element scroll top is above 20, we want to set our show scroll to true, else we want to set it to false. Lastly, we are going to pass this to our window.onScroll, which will be a function. It will use this scroll function we just defined as the return value. Let's go ahead and save this. Let's make a quick fix. Instead of bottom 0, we will change it to 10. Let's go ahead and pass the function. So on click of this icon, we want to render the function scroll to top. Let's go back to the use scroll to top and make some quick fix. Instead of exporting the function as default, we will change the export to named. So now we can see when I scroll a bit up, the icon doesn't show, but if I start scrolling down, it shows. And if I click on it, it will scroll it all the way to the top. So this is exactly what we want to achieve. This will essentially be all for this session. In the next part, we are going to work on the hero section. In this part, we are going to implement our hero section. In addition to this, we will be adding our first hook, which is the typing effect hook. Let's start by creating a new folder. I'll navigate into my source. Inside the component, I'm going to add a new folder and I'll call it home. Inside this home folder, I'm going to create a new file. Let's call it hero section. Now, let's start a new component. I will be importing our divider from our layout component. Let's go ahead and define some of the content that will be in this hero section. We will be having two sides. The right part will have our image and the left part will have the content. Let's start with the left side. So I'll go ahead and make a comment here and let's call it content. Let's replicate that and call this image. So for the content, I will be using a div as my container. Inside this div, I will use the h1 element. On another line, I will use another h1 element. Next, I will use the p tag to add some basic information about me. Let me go ahead and copy some text that I have. Next, I will go ahead and add two buttons. So this will be the CTA buttons for our hero section. Now, I will give this first button a class name and I will make it button secondary. I will go ahead and give the next button btn primary. Before we go on with the styling, let's go back into our root page. And in here, I'm going to import our hero section. And let's replace this temporary home page divider we created earlier. So as you can see, we already have the text that we added. We will add some styling to this. Inside this container, I'll be adding the following class properties. I will give it a flex. I'll also make it flex column, and I'll give it a gap of 6. Lastly, I'll give it a minimum weight of 3/5. Alright, let's go ahead and save that. And as we can see, it has given us some spacing. The next thing I will want to do is to add a class property to the name. I'll give it a style of text primary and also make it block so we can see the color changes. Let's go ahead and style the buttons. I will also give this a flex. I will make them item center and I'll give it a gap of 10. We will also want some social icons here. So let's go ahead and import the social icons we used in our footer. This is the reason why we made the component generic and kept it in the shed. So now we can reuse it here without re-implementing. Let's create a new div right here. Inside this div, I will create a new p tag and type connect on social. Also, I will add a div which I will style as a line, and lastly, I will render the social media links. Let's give this a different style. So I'll give it a class name and I'll give it a style of text white and also make it uppercase. For the main container, I'll give it flex, a gap of 4, and I'll center the items. Now let's go ahead and create the line that will act as the divider. So I'll give this empty div a class and I'll give it a height of 0.5 pixels. I will give it a weight of 20 and a background color of white. Next, we will implement our image section and create a new image tag. I will provide the source very soon and I'll give it an alternative content of hero image. I will give it the class name and the following style. We want the width to be full. On medium screen and above, we want the width to be 2 feet of whatever the width is. We also want it fully rounded on medium screen and we want it rounded on smaller screen. Let's go ahead and close this. So I will be importing an image called hero image. Let's go up here and import this image. So now we can see we have the content on the top and the image on the bottom. We want the image to be on the right while our content stays on the left. So we will be giving our main container a class name and add the necessary changes. I'll give it a flex and give it justify between. I will also make the item centered and give it a gap of 10. On medium screen, I want the gap to be even larger, so I'll give it a gap of 40. Also, I want it flex wrap only on smaller screens, but for medium, I want it to stay like this, so I'll give it flex no wrap. Let's save that. And as we can see, we have our text on the left, we have some spacing, and then we have the image. We will also want to give it a margin top just to give it a cleaner look. So I'll give it a margin top of 14, and for medium screens and above, I'll give it a margin top of 40. So we can see the separation between the header and our hero. Lastly, we will go ahead and wrap this around an empty tag. The reason we want to do this is so that we can render our divider right away. So I'll put the divider just before this. So we can see right after our hero section, we have our divider. The next thing we would want to do is to make this name Kayla have a typing effect. I'll go into my folder, and inside my hooks folder, I will create a new file and we will call it use typing effect. First, we will import the use effect and use state. We will also export the function use typing effect, which should accept text and speed. And we want to initialize the speed to 400. This is 400 milliseconds, so that's equivalent to 4 seconds. So we will create the current index and set current index. This will be a number, so we'll set its initial value to 0. We will also create the current count and set current count. Similar to our index, this is also a number. Lastly, we want to create the current letter and set current letter. And this is going to be our return value. This is expecting a string. Let's go ahead and return our current letter. In between this, I will implement a function within our use effect. So I will initialize a use effect snippet, clean this up, and go ahead and create a new function and call it type letter. First, we want to get the current text because we are passing an array of strings, so we want to know which index of string we are at. And we will be tracking that using the current index. So we will pass that into our text array. Next, we will check if our current text dot length is greater than the current count. Then we want to get the letter. So we can do current text dot slice from 0 up to the current count plus 1. We will set our current letter to the letter that we just sliced, and we will reset our current count based on the previous count. So we will get the previous count and we will add plus 1 to the previous count. So we are incrementally getting each character of the text that we are at. Next, we will implement our else condition. We'll be using a set timeout, and inside this timeout, we will set the current count to 0 and set our current index to the previous index plus 1 modulo our text length. Lastly, we will pass in our speed that we are receiving from the function. Let's go ahead and pass this to our set timeout. So we will create a timer, call it set timeout, and pass the type letter. We will also pass the speed, and we will return a clear timeout. Also, we want to be tracking the current index and current count changes. So let's pass that values in our use effect. So whenever anything changes here, we want to render this function. Let's go ahead and import this in our hero section. Let's get the current letter from this function. We are expecting an array of text and also the speed. I'll go ahead and create a text. We will pass this to our use effect hook. And now we can replace the current text that we have right here. So instead of typing Kayla, we can now replace it with this. Let's save it. As we can see, we have the typing effects right here. We can also go ahead and check if this is responsive. And this is also responsive. If I scroll down, click, I can move to the top. So that will be it for our hero section. In our next section, we are going to work on the project. See you in the next section. In this part, we are going to work on our project section. I'll go into our source directory. Inside the components, I'll go ahead and add a new folder in our home. I'll call this project. I'll create our first file and name it index.jsx. Let's go ahead and instantiate a new component. I'll change the name to project section. I'll clean this up and import our section layout. In here, I'll pass the title and I'll give it a title of project section. I'll give it a subtitle. Lastly, I'll give it the children component, which we will implement soon. So the children component will be called project. And let's close this. Now I'll go ahead and import this. Let's go ahead and implement this project component. Let's return a temporary div and let's say project. Back in our home page, we will import this section and I will render this right after our hero section. So if we scroll down, we can see our project section. One quick fix we will need to do is to remove the divider down here. So we will not be needing this outer empty wrapper. Let's go ahead and clean this up also. In here, we would also have to add some margin down. So I'll give this a class name and I'll give it a margin bottom of 5. You can see our project section and its subtitle has separated nicely. We will go back into our folder. In our project, I'm going to add a new file and I'm going to call it tag. In here, I will start a new component. So let's use the RAFC. And for this tag, what I want to do is I want to create a common tag that we will be using in our project item. So let's go ahead and clean this up. I will be exporting a div. And in this div, I will also create another container. This container is going to render an icon and also a label. Let's pass the label. All these values, we are expecting them as a prop, so I will pass it in the prop. And in addition to this, we will also be expecting the background color. And lastly, the color. So in here, I'm going to create a class name. And using the string literals, I will be giving it an inline flex. I will also center the items, give it a gap of 1, and lastly pass the background color and color. Let's go ahead and save this. So now down here, I will create 4 tags, which will simply be a tag and an icon that we will import shortly, the background color, which we will give it a background of gray, and label, we will say front end. Let's go ahead and import the icons we need. So we will just need 2 icons. Feel free to use whichever icons you deem fit for this side. But I'm using the FA code and FA code pen. So I'll go ahead and copy this and paste it here. Change this to backend. And in here, I'm going to change this to the code pen. So it's the same value as this. Also, I want to use the color yellow for the background and pass a color of text black. Lastly, I will also make another tag, and this tag will be our full stack. This will stay the same, but the background color will be pink. This file will be part of the resources attached to this video, so go ahead and download it. I've already imported all the tags that we just created. In addition to that, I'm importing some images that are in the assets, so this will all be available in the video resources. And in here, I'm going to export the following. So I will export a const called tag. So we will put all common constants that we will use in multiple places. So I'll go back into my projects folder and add a new file and call it project item. In this project item, I will start a new component, and I'll go ahead and import an icon that we will need. So I'll be using the open new window icon from the React icons library. Next, I'll go ahead and pass all the props that we will need. So we will need the image. We will also need the title, tag, description, and lastly, our preview link. The reason why we are adding this in its own component is we will be using this project item in multiple places, so you don't want to create this component over and over again. So it's always a good idea to isolate components that are reusable so that it's easier for you to import and pass the changing values. I will create a new div as our container, and inside it I'll create another div. In here I'll give it an image. In here, let's create a new tag image, and for the source we'll be using the prop image, and for alternative we can use a string literal, and we will write the title. So here we can do. Next, we will also render the tag which we created earlier. Let's go ahead and also add our title, which will be an H3 element, and the label is our title prop. We will add a p tag, and this will be our description. Also, our description will have the following styles. We will make the text small. Next, let's create a new div, and inside this div we'll add a button. This button will also have the preview icon. We'll have the RX open window icon, and we'll give it a class name with the following style. So we want it inline, we want it on the same line as our text, and we want to give it a margin right of 1 between it and the text. And we can add our text here, so live preview. Also, we want to give this a class name of BTN secondary, and when we click on this button we want to open a new preview link. So I'll go ahead and create a function, and we will call it open new preview link. Let's go ahead and create this function. Right before the return, I'll create a constant and make this function. So what this function will essentially do is it will use the window.open. We will pass the URL as a preview link that we are passing as a prop. And lastly, we also want to open it in a new page, so we can add blank here. Now let's go ahead and add some style for the container itself. I will give it a minimum width of 300 pixels and a maximum width of 400 pixels. I'll make it cursor pointer. Next, I'll give it a bit of shadow in the background, so shadow medium. And for the transition, I'll make it ease in, out. I also want to delay it for 150 milliseconds, and on hover, I want to scale it to 110%. The scaling duration should also be 150. Lastly, I'll give it a flex and give it a flex column and give a gap of 3. Let's go ahead and save that. So now we can go back into our index.jsx and implement our components. Here, I'm going to import our project items that we just created. I will also import the project itself, and I will import the tags constant. Let's clean this up. So the first thing we want to do is we will go ahead and create a container. I'm going to give it a class name, which we will define soon. I'll give this a flex and medium, justify, center. Also, I'll give it overflow on the x-axis scroll because we will have a lot of project items and we want them on the same horizontal layer. At the same time, we don't want it to be clustered, so we will allow a scroll and hide the rest of the content so the user can scroll from right to left and left to right. We will give it a weight of full. And now let's go ahead and make use of the project. So I'll be using the map and I'll get each project and return the project item we created and pass the necessary values. So I'll pass the title. I will also pass the description, the tag, and preview link. Let's also not forget to pass the project image. And I'll go ahead and save this. Now we will give it a key and we'll pass the index. As we can see in our browser, we have all the project items. We would also need to add some gap in between this. Let's go ahead and wrap this around a different div. The reason why we are creating another container is because, as I mentioned earlier, we want to allow this to be a scroll. So we will need to change the flex. We will need to change the class and we will need to give it some styles. Let's give it flex and we will give it a gap of 10. So this will automatically put everything on a row. Let me save that. So as you can see, I can scroll left and right and see each project. One quick fix we will have to do is to go back into our tags component. As we can see, this part will need some spacing. So I'll go ahead and give it a padding X of 1 and a padding Y of 1 also. If I save it, you can see the spacing. A shortcut for this is just giving it P1. It will give it the same value for the padding up, down, left and right. Lastly, let's make this a bit rounded. So I'll give it rounded small and go ahead and save it. So we can see there is a subtle roundness on the tag. Let's go back to the index and continue with the implementation. Now we can see the scroll icon here and we want to hide it. So in order to do so, I'll create a new class in our index.css and I'll call it hide scroll. Let's navigate back into our index.css. So I'll create a new class and as we already named it, we call it hide scroll. So I'll go ahead and copy that and paste it here. In this class, I'll give it a scroll bar width of none. As you can see, it disappeared. And we will also give it for different browsers. So I'll give it the overflow style of none. Next, we will define the same class for our WebKit browsers. And that will be all for our scroll. The last thing we want to do is we want to add an ability for us to filter projects. So now the reason why we added the tags is because we want to enable users to see which specific project we have made, and is it backend, frontend, or full stack, or whatever tag we add. So we will add a new component, and this component, we will call it filter tags. Let's use the RAFC to create our initial component. We will also import the tags that we define in our constant. Now I'll clean this up and pass to properties. So we will need the active tag, and also we will need on tag click. In here, I'll create a new container and I'll give it the following class. So for our style, we will use the string literal because we want to check if our current tag is active, the active tag is all. We want to make the background green. And if that's not the case, we want the background to be gray. So for padding left and right, we want to give it 4. Up and down, 2. And we want to make it rounded. We also want to give it a cursor pointer and give it a hover of background secondary. On click, we will call the function on tag click and pass the tag's name. So our first tag is going to be all. Now we can replicate this for the other tags. So the second one we will have is for front end, and here we can change this to front end. And we will change this to front end. Now, if we realize we are kind of repeating ourselves, so instead of doing this, I'll go ahead and create an array called tags here. And inside this, I'll give it a key and I'll use the tags.all, and this will be an object. I will also give it a label and I will call this our all. So we will need to make the same for the rest of the tags. So we will have the front end, and we will change this to front end, and we can now rename the label to front end as well. Let's do the same for our back end. So I will change this to back end. And lastly, we can do it for the full stack. So we can change the whole label to full stack. And let's not forget to make this capitalized. So now, instead of repeating myself, I'll go ahead and clean this up. In here, I'll be using tags.map. I'll get each tag and I'll simply return this. But now I can use the tag.key here. Also, I will use the tag.label. So that will be all for our tags. I'll go ahead and import this in our index. We will be placing the filter tag just above the items themselves. So I will go ahead and wrap this around an empty element. Just before our project items, I will create a new container and I will render our filter tags. As we already know, we need to pass the active tag, which we will create as a state. And we will also need to pass the on tag click, which we will create in a second. So this will be a function called handle on tag click. And we will close this. So now I'll go ahead and create this function. This will be expecting a tag. Next, I will import the use state from the React library, and I will create a state called active tag and set active tag. By default, we want our state to be tags.all. And when we click on the tag, we want to set it to the current active tag. Our active tag is already highlighted, and when we hover on it, we can see the different tags if I click on it. Now let's go ahead and make this a flex. So I'll give this a class name. Give it a margin bottom of 10. And we will go back into our filter tags. And in here, we will give it a flex. we'll give it a gap of 10 and also make it flex wrap. So we can see the tags have separated themselves there. Let's go ahead and add the ability to filter our project. So now if I click on front end, back end, I still see the same project. So I want to be able to just filter only projects that have the tag backend or any other tag that I click. So in our index.jsx, we can filter the project. So we call this filtered project based on the tag. So if our tag, active tag, is equal to tag.all, we just want to return the project. If that's not the case, we want to filter the project and find all the project tag that's equal to the current active tag. So now we will replace this project array that we were mapping to render each items with this. And let's save it. Because we have all selected, that's why we can see the project. If I click on front end, it filters only front end project. If I click on backend, it also filters only backend projects. Full stack, the same. I can also scroll to the right and scroll to the left. So this is it for our project section. In the next part, we are going to work on our blogs section. In this video, we are going to work on our blogs section. I have gone ahead to create a folder within our source, component, home, and I've created the blocks. In addition to that, I already added some blocks that we can use for testing purposes. Next, I'll create an index.jsx, and in here, we can go ahead and import React. I'll go ahead and change the name to blocks. Also, I'll create a new component. We can just duplicate this, and here we can do block section. This will be our actual return value. I'll go ahead and import our section layout. We will now replace this div here with our section. This is a component, so let's render it and pass the necessary props. I'll give it the title, blocks. I'll give it a subtitle. And lastly, I will go ahead and render the blocks that we have above. So now we will go into our root and we can import our blocks. We will render this right after the project section. And let's save that. So I have to import it like this. Now, if I scroll down, you can see we have our block section. Let's go ahead and implement the blocks. So in here, I'll do some cleanup and render a div. I'll go back to my folder and add a new file and call it block item. Similar to what we did in our project, we don't want to recreate all the block item every time we want to define a new block. So we will go ahead and create a generic one here. I'll go ahead and import React and create my component. This component will be expecting the image, the title, the summary, tags, and an index. In here, I'm going to return a div which will have the key as our index. Next, I'll create a div in which we will keep our image. So I'll give the image the source as our image prop and the alternative as string literal with the title. So we will give it title and then image. Also, we want to give it a class name that we will define very soon. And let's close this. Next, we will define our content. So I will create another div. And in here, I will create an h3 tag. And we can render our title right here. Next, we can render our description or summary. Also, we'll be creating some tags and we'll create a different component for it. So we will call the component tags and pass these tags as its prop. Lastly, I will create a new button. And in this button, we can call it read more. This button is also expecting an arrow, which I will import from the React icons library. So let's go ahead and render this icon. Now I will be adding the necessary classes. For our main item container, we will give it a class name and we'll make this string literal. We'll give it a flex and we'll make it flex column. Also on medium screen, we want the flex to be row. I want the item centered and a gap of 10. Now we want to check if our index is equal to 1 because we always want to render 3 blocks on our home page. So if our index is 1, what we want to do is we want the medium to be row reverse. So I'll give it flex row reverse. We will see in a couple of minutes why we need this. Next, I'll go ahead and style our image. So for the image container, I'll give it a weight full and I'll give it a weight for our small screen with 50%, so 1.5. Next, for the image itself, I want it rounded to be medium and I also want the weight full. I want the height to be auto. We will now style our content container. So I'll give this a class name. Give it a flex. I also want this in a column and I want the items to be flexed out. I'll give it a gap of 4. For our title, we will give it a text size of 2 extra large, a font of semi-bold. We will not do anything to our p tag. And next, let's add the button class. So for the button, we'll be using button secondary. Lastly, we will give a class to our icon. We will make it inline and give it a margin left of 2. Now, the only thing we are not importing is our tag, so I'll go ahead and create a new component for that. In here, I'll simply import my React from React. I will also create the component itself, and as we know, we have to pass the prop. So let me go ahead and pass it. So this is expecting tags. We can export this as default. For this component, we will create an outer container div and also another container. For the inner container, we'll give it a class name and we'll give it flex and gap of 2. We will also want it flex wrap on smaller screens. Next, we will render the tags by mapping through them. So I'll get each tag and their index. Let's change this to a bracket so that we return right away. I'll create a span and in here we will be dynamically rendering the class. So for our class name, I will use the string literals. First, I'm going to give it a padding horizontal of 2 and vertical of 1. I'll make the text small, give it a rounded, and also make the opacity a bit down. So I'll give it an opacity of 70. Now, I'll go ahead and create a condition. So first, what we want to do is we want to render this in a way that we are dynamically using 5 colors. So assuming we have 5 tags, we want each of the tags to have a different color. So I will check if our index modulo 5, and this is just a quick trick to do that, is equal to 0. I want our background to be primary. If our index modulo 5 is equal to 1, we want the background to be yellow and the text to be black. Else, if our index modulo 5 is equal to 2, we want the background to be purple. And if our index modulo 5 is equal to 3, we will use the background secondary, and our else statement will be background pink. So this will dynamically change the color of our tag based on these conditions that we've provided. Now we will also pass the key as the index, and we will render the tag. We can now go back to our index.jsx, and in here we are going to do the necessary modification. So we will be returning a div, and inside this div we will import our blocks. So let's go ahead and do that. So we will map through the blocks and get each block. We will also get the index, and we can return it. So for each block item, we need to pass the title, the image, our tags, summary, and lastly our index. So as we can see, we have our blog section also showing nicely, and this is responsive. So far we have all the blog sections, and as I mentioned earlier, we just want to show 3 blocks. So instead of mapping through everything, I will slice from 0 up to the 3rd value. So if I go ahead and save that, we can see now there are only 3 blocks. We will also need to add some spacing between this. So we will give the outer container a class name, and we'll give it flex. We'll make it flex column and give it a gap of 10. Let's save that so we can see the spacing. Let's go ahead and verify if it works also on mobile screen. So on mobile screen, as we can see, we have each image rendering before the content. And this is the reason why in our blog we added this reverse. Also, we can see the tags have different colors. This will be all for our blogs section. Next, we will implement the testimony section. In this section, we are going to work on adding a testimony part to our homepage. I have gone ahead and created a folder. In this folder, I have added a file called testimonies, and in here I have added some testimonies. So go ahead and download that from the resources attached to this video and customize it. Next, I will create a new file and I'll call it index.jsx. In here, I'm going to import React and I'm going to create my testimonies. This will return a div. For now, we will just write testimonials. We will now import our section. Next, let's go ahead and define our testimonial section. This will return our section layout. We will pass the title. We will also pass the subtitle, and we will render the children. Let's go ahead and close this. We will go ahead and export this as default. In our root file, we will import this, so we can go ahead and change this to testimonials. We will render this right after our blog. If we scroll down, we can see our testimonial section template has been added. Let's go ahead and add the implementation. First, I'm going to import 2 arrows from our React icons library. We will use these 2 arrows to swipe left and right. We will go ahead and install a new package called Swiper. We will be using this to implement the animation for swiping left and right. So let's go ahead and run npm install swiper. Once this is installed, we can import the following from swiper. We will import the swiper call, we will also import swiper and swiper slide. This will be coming from the swiper React. Next, let's import the swiper CSS modules, and we will import navigation from the swiper modules. Before we do anything, we will tell our swiper call to use this navigation. It accepts an array of modules, and we are using the navigation modules. Now that we have our swiper set up, let's go ahead and implement the main component. I will create a div within this, and inside this div, I'm going to give it a class name. I'll also give the outer container a class name and make the width full. Now for this div, we are going to give some styles for our button. So I'll give this a flex. I'll give it a medium of justify center. I'll give them a gap of 5, a margin bottom of 10, and make the cursor pointer. Now I'll go ahead and render the two icons. So we can render the first one and the second one and change this to right. As we can see in our browser, we have the icons rendering. Next, I'll give these icons some class properties. What I will do is I'll give it a hover, and I want the text to be secondary whenever we hover on it. Also, I'll give them a class, which we will use for our swiping later. The reason why we need this class is because we are implementing our own swiper arrows. Usually the swiper package comes with pre-config arrows, but we want to use our own arrows. Now let's go ahead and also give this a size. We want the size to be 40. One quick fix is we are supposed to add an arrow here. So let me save that. And now if I hover on it, we can see our icons have the background to be secondary. This will be all for our buttons. Now we will implement the actual testimonies. So I will import our testimonies. I will create a swiper. Next, I will use the swiper as our parent component. And in here, I'm going to pass some properties. I want the slides per view by default to be 1. I want to give them a space of 20. Next, I will use the navigation. And in here, I'm going to pass the custom class name we created. So for previous, we want it to be left. And for our next element, we want it to be right. I'll give it an effect of fade. And I'll customize the fade effect to be crossfade. I'll give it a speed of 1000, which is 1 second. And I'll define the following breakpoints. So for our smaller screens, like mobile screens, we want our slides per view to be 1. And we want to maintain the space of 20. Let's copy this and modify it for the next screen. For our medium screen, which is 768, we want slides per view to be 2 and a spacing of 30. We will go ahead and copy this and define the last view. And for our large screen, so anything above 1224, we want to show 3 slides per view and we want to give spacing of 40. Let's add our comma. So this will all be the props that we'll pass to our swiper. Now we will go through our testimonials, map this and get each testimony. We will also get the index. For our return, we are going to define our slide, our swiper slide. We will pass the key as the index and we will close this. The next thing we would have to do is to create our testimonial item. In this file, I will go ahead and import React. I will also import an icon that we will use. And this icon will act as our review stars. So I'll create a custom review stars here. And in here, I'll simply create a return value with our container, which is a div. I'll give it a class name and provide flex. Now I'll render our FA star, give it a class name and make the text color yellow. I'll give it a size of 20 and render this 5 times. So this will be our review star. Next, let's create our testimonial item. This will take the message. It will also take the image and the name. We will also be expecting the title. Let's go ahead and export this as the default. We will create a container using the div. And in this container, we are going to pass the following. So we'll give it a class name and we will come back to define it soon. Next, we will give the stars here. So we will render our stars that we define up there. We will create the message and we will pass our message prop we receive. Now I'll create a div, give it a class name that we will define. And in here, I'm going to render an image. This image will get the source as our image from the prop. We will give it an alternative name. We will use our string literal and we will say testimonial picture of the person who gave the testimonial. Next, we will give this a class name and we can go ahead and close the tag. The last thing we want to do is to create another container. We will render an h5 element and this will be where we will put the person's name. Next, we will give the person a title, whatever their position is. And let's save that. So back in our index, we can now import this component. Next, in our swiper slide, I'm going to go ahead and add a closing tag. In here, I'm going to pass all the necessary values to this testimonial item. I'll pass the message, dot message. I'll get the name, the title, and lastly, the image. First, we will give the outer layer the following class. We'll give it a background of dark blue, padding of 4. We will make it rounded large, a flex, and a flex column. We will give them a gap of 2 and make the width full. For our medium and larger screens, we want our width to be 350 pixels. Let's go ahead and save that. So this is how we want the testimonial background to be. Now for our image, I'll give it a flex. I'll give it a gap of 5. And I'll center the items. Also, let's give it a margin top of 8. And let's save that. For the image class itself, I will give it a width of 12 and a height of 12. I will make it a circle, so I'll give it rounded or full. So this is how we want our image to be. So we are going to continue styling the title and the name. Also, we will need to move this right into this side. And as we can see, we have our image on the left and our text on the right. Let's add a bit of spacing between the stars and the text. I'll go over here and give it a class name and give it margin top of 2. We will go ahead and fix this. So instead of just passing it as an icon, we will be rendering it. Now if we save it, we can see our project has the right icons in front of it. In here, we are supposed to be passing the class, so we need to add a dot. And we will add another dot. Now we will go ahead and put this in a div. So I will create a div. And in here, I'm going to give it a class name and give it a flex of gap 4. And let's save it. If I click on the right, I can see the testimony swipe to the left. And if I click to the left, the testimony swipe to the right as expected. So this will be all for our testimonies. We would want to check it on mobile screen to ensure everything looks good. And as we can see, if we change this to mobile, this renders correctly. And this is exactly what we want. If we click back here, we can see everything is responsive. In this part, we are going to work on our services section. I've already gone ahead and created our services file where we will keep all the services that we have. This will also be attached to this lecture as a resource. You can go ahead and download it and modify it to your satisfaction. I've also created our index.jsx. We will go in there and start implementing this component. I will import React from React. I will create a component called services and I will return a div that says services for now. Now I will create our services section and also export that. I will export it as default. I'll go ahead and import our section layout and provide the necessary values. So our section layout is expecting a title, which we will call services, a subtitle, which I'll copy and paste from my notes, and lastly, the children. Let's close this tag. Now let's go ahead and implement the service section. First, we will import an arrow from our React icons. We will also import the services array, and I'll clean this up. I'll map through our services, get each service and their index. I'll create a container using the div. Inside this, I'm going to add the services icon and give it the following class name. I will make it text primary and give it a size of 60. I will also render the service title and the description of the service. Lastly, I will put the arrow that I imported from React icons down here. This is just for styling purposes and this arrow doesn't have any functionality. Now let's go ahead and provide the key as this index. We will go into our root and import this. So I'll duplicate this and change testimony to services. And now I will import this from services. So right after our testimonies, I will duplicate and replace this with services section. Let's go ahead and save it. So there is a typo in here. This comma is not meant to be there. So we will have to return this in order to see it render in our browser. So now we can see our services section here. Now I'll go ahead and give this a class name and give it a flex I will also want it to be wrapped on smaller screen and give it a gap of 20. Also, I would want it to be justify center and give it a weight full. Let's go ahead and save that. We will go ahead and style the main container. So here I'll be giving it flex and I'll give it flex column. I'll also give it item start and a padding of 6. I'll give it a background of dark blue and roundness. Next, on the small screen, I want the width to be 250 pixels, and on medium or larger screens, I want the width to be 350 pixels. Also, I want to give it a hover and I'll make it border. When we hover on it, I want the border color to be primary. So let's go ahead and test this. And I would also want this to scale. So we will give it a scaling of 110%. Let's give it a gap of 5 pixels. Now when we hover on it, it's not smooth, so let's go ahead and give it some duration. So I'll give it a transition, transform, and give it a duration of 750. If I save it and go back, we can see this is smoother. Alright, this will be all for our services section. We are going to work on the frequently asked questions section. I've already created our index.jsx and I've also added some content related to the frequently asked questions we will use for demo purposes. This will also be attached to the resources and you can go ahead and download. Let's go into the implementation. I will import React and also the use state, which we will use later on. Next, I will import 2 icons from the React icons library and I will import our section. I will also go ahead and import the FAQs that we just added. Now let's go ahead and create the component. So I'll call this FAQ and this will return a function that we will implement soon. Also, we will go ahead and create our FAQ section and this will return our section layout. We'll give it a title and we will call it frequently asked questions. In here, we will add a subtitle of got any question and we'll give it the child component of FAQ. Let's close this. Now I'll return a div and in this div I'll just render a p tag and say FAQ. We will go into our roots file and import this. So I'll duplicate our services and change this to FAQ. In here, I will also duplicate the services and render this component. Let's go ahead and save it. We added some extra space in here, so I'll go ahead and remove that. We will also need to export this component. And if we reload it and go down, we can see our frequently asked questions. Let's go ahead and add the actual implementation. So in here, I'll map through my FAQs and get each question. So I will return a div, and for the key, we can use the FAQ.id. Now let's go ahead and render the contents inside this. So for our FAQ, first we will give this a class name and we will give this an accordion. We will be using the accordion class utility from Tailwind. I will give it a padding vertical of 6 and a horizontal of 4. I will give it a rounded of 2 extra large and give it a background of dark blue. Next, I'll give it a border button, and I'll also give the border color of gray. Let's go ahead and save it. So we can see from our browser we have some divider with nothing inside. Let's continue to add the content. In here, I'm going to create a button. And this button, I'm going to give it the following class. I will give it an accordion of toggle and give it a group. I will make it inline flex, and also I will center the items. I will use justify between and give it a weight full. Next, I would want the text to be left aligned and give it a leading of 8, which is line spacing. On hover, I will give it a text of secondary and a background of dark blue. We will also have an onClick function here, and when we click on it, very soon we are going to create a function and we will call it toggle question. So let me go ahead and pass that. And in here, we are going to pass the FAQ ID. Next, we will render our FAQ content. So it will have the question itself, which we are using our H5 as a tag to render these. And we'll pass this as FAQ question. Also, we will give this a class name, and we will use the string literal to render this conditionally. We will want to render our content. So now I'll check if our open question accordion is the same as the current FAQ ID. Then we want the text color to be secondary. If that's not the case, then we don't want to give it any color. Let's save that. Now let's go ahead and define our state. So I will create a state and I'll call it open question and set open question. This will have an initial value of null. And now we will create a function called toggle question, which will accept the question ID, and we will check if open question is equal to our question ID. We want to set open question to null. Else we want to set it to the current question ID. We will verify this implementation very soon. Let's go ahead and add some content. So right after the title, we want to use the icons that we created. We will create a condition and we will check if our open question is equal to the current FAQ ID .id. We want to render the arrow up. So I will use iOS arrow up and give it a size of 25, and I'll give it the following class name. I will close this and do the same for our arrow down. So I will copy this and change this to down. Let's go ahead and save it. Now we can see that the color is highlighted, and that's not what we want. So we only want to add this conditionally. So I'll go ahead and modify this, and now I will use a string literal. So I will open this, wrap this in a string literal, and we will check if open question is equal to our FAQ.id. Then we want to render this. If that's not the case, then we just want to render an empty string. So I'll go ahead and clean this up and save. So now you can see that it's not showing green anymore. Next, we are going to add some class name to our main container, and we'll give this accordion group. We will also make the weight full. Let's go ahead and render the content itself. So for the content, we will check right after the button if open question is equal to our FAQ.id. Then we want to render the following content. So we will add a p tag, which will be the content, and in here we can do faq.answer. Let's fix this name. Okay, so now when I click on it, we can see our content. Let's style this content a bit as it is out of place. So I'll give the main container a class name. I'll give it an accordion content, and I'll give it a weight full. I'll give the padding on the horizontal 0, and I'll give it an overflow hidden. Lastly, we will style the main content tag. We'll give it a margin top of 4 and a padding on the horizontal of 4. So now we can see it. Now the reason why we added this here was because when we click on, let's say, what is your background, and we go and click on can I hire, we want to close the previous one and open this. So now if I click anywhere else, if this is open, then I want to reset the value of the new open question. And that's the reason why we needed the state to manage this. Let's test this in smaller screen to make sure this is responsive. So on my smaller screen, you can see this is also responsive, and when we click on it, the content shows as expected. In this section, we will go ahead and create our last component for the home page. We will be adding the Contact Me section, and also we will add the functionality to be able to navigate to the Contact Me section on the home page wherever we are in our website. First, let's go ahead and create a new file in our component home, and I will call it Contact Me. In this file, I'll go ahead and import React, and I will also import the use state from our React library. I will import the section layout. Next, I will create a component called Contact Me, which we will soon pass to our Contact Me section component. And now I'll return a div, and in here I'll just return a p tag and say contact. Let's go ahead and define the contact section. We will be using our section layout, so let me define that. We will pass the title, we will say Contact Me, and the subtitle, which I'll go ahead and paste a title from my notes here. Lastly, we will define the children, which will be the component we just defined above. I will close this component and remove this comma. Let me save. Now I'll go ahead and export this as a default. Inside our roots file, I will import this. I'll go ahead and replicate the FAQ and replace it with the Contact Me. So if we scroll down, we have our Contact Me section. Let's go ahead and implement the main component. I'll clear the content here. I'll make a form container. In this form, I'm going to render the following component. So I'll make a div, and in this div, I'll give an input. And for this input, I'll give it a placeholder and say enter name. I'll give it a name of name and a type of text. I will also make it a required property and give it a value of form data.name. I'll give it on change of handle on change, which we will implement later. I'll close this tag and save it. Now I'll replicate this for our email. So in here, I'll say enter your email and change the name to email. I'll also change the form data to email. We will add a state to handle this form also. And I'll change the type to email. Before we go on with the implementation, let's go ahead and implement our state. So I'll define a state and I'll call it form data. And I'll also set the form data, and I will use state and pass in the following objects. By default, our name will be an empty string. Our email will also be an empty string. Our subject will be an empty string. And lastly, our message will also be an empty string. Let's go ahead and implement the onChange. So I'll create a function called handle onChange. It will accept the event. And now I'll set the form data, get the previous data, and copy the previous data into a new object. And now I will reset whatever the target name is to the new input from the user. Let's save that. So if we scroll down into our contact section, we now have this input for name and email. Let's go ahead and style this. So for our divider, we will give it a class name and we'll make it weight full. We'll also give the maximum weight as 2 extra large, and we will make our margin left and right auto. I'll give it a padding of 6, and I'll give it an ID of contact. We are giving this ID because this is how we will access this section through the URL. Now I'll go ahead and start the form. So I'll give this a class name and give this a flex. I'll also make sure it's a flex wrap on smaller screen, and we will use the flex column. I'll give it a gap of 10. Next, let's start these two components. Let's start these two inputs. So I want them to be on the same row. I'll give it flex, and on smaller screens, I want it flex column, and for medium and above, I want it flex row. I'll give it a gap of 10. And now we can see the two inputs are on the same row, but with a gap in between. Let's go ahead and add the rest of our form. So I'll go ahead and copy our previous input and modify it for the next one. I'll put this input here, and now I will write your subject instead of enter name. We will change this to subject and we'll maintain the text. We will also change this to subject, and let's save it. So we have our subject here. Let's go ahead and create a text area for the message. We will give it a placeholder of enter message, a placeholder of your message. We will give it a name of message, and we will give it a type of text. By default, we want the number of rows to be 5, and we will want this to be required. We will also want to pass the value, and it will be form data.message. Lastly, I want to pass the onChange, and we will handle onChange. I'll close this and save it. And if I scroll down, we have our message area here. The last thing we would add is our button to send. So I'll add a div, and in this div, I'll create a button. I'll give it a class name of button secondary, and we will close it. I'll name it send, and we would want this button send to be on the right side. So I'll give the div a class name and give it a self, and this will push it to the right side. So that's it for our contact me section. The next thing we will do is we will go into our layout, and in here we are going to import a component that we will create in just a couple of seconds. This component, we will call it scroll to anchor, and this will be coming from a file that we will create, which is called scroll to anchor. We will render this component right before our navigation. So let's go ahead and put this right here. I'll create a new file in the shed, and we will call it the scroll to anchor. I will import React, and now I will define the function. This function is not expecting any prop, so we don't need to pass anything. I will export it as default. Let's go ahead with the implementation. First, we would like to get the location, and to get the location, we will use location from the React router DOM. I will import that into the file. So use location from React router DOM. Next, I will create a ref called last hash, and I will also use ref, and I will import that now. I'll replicate this and change this last name to timeout ref. So I'll be importing the use effect as well to implement this. In here, I'll define a use effect, which will accept an empty array as the dependency list, and I'll return a function which clears a timeout if there is a timeout in its current. So if timeout.current, then we want to clear the timeout. Now we'll create another use effect. This time we will be passing the location as the dependency. We will get a hash, and we can do that by getting the location.hash.slice. We will check if our hash is not empty and our hash is not the same as our last hash. Then we want to get the element that is in the hash. So get element by ID. And this is the reason why we pass the ID to the contact form. So we will pass this hash. And now we will check if this element exists. We will create a timeout. So we will set a timeout ref.current to a set timeout, which will accept a callback function and also the speed. So we will give this 100. Next, we will add throw into view as the behavior of this element. And for the behavior, we want it to be smooth. And for block, we want it to be start. So at the start of the section. Also, we can clean this up since we didn't use the React for anything. Also, if we console log the hash, we can see this is what the value is. We want to get that. We want to get the first position. So if we add 1 to the slice, so it should get all the elements from the first index. We will just get the contact, and that's exactly what we need. So let's add a value of 1 so that we slice excluding the hash. Now if we reload it, and assuming we go to resume page and we click on let's talk, I'm expecting it to scroll to the home page and the contact me section. So let's go ahead and test that, and we can see this works as expected. That will be all for our contact me. In this section, we are going to work on the resume page. The resume page is quite simple, and we will be using just 2 components to achieve that. Also, I will attach a resource which will contain the content for my resume. So I have the experiences and I also have the education. You can go ahead and modify this. So I have also created 2 components, the left side and the right side, because our resume will have 2 sides. Now let's go into our route, and in the resume page, we will go ahead and import this component. So I'm going to import my left side and right side. Now I will replace this with a div, and inside this div, I want to render our left side, and also I will copy this and render our right side. Let's go back into the left side and export a component. So I'll initialize a React component. We will also return a div and just give a p tag and type left side. We will now go ahead and export this as default. Let's copy this and make the same changes for our right side. We can just change the name from left to right, and also change the text to right. In my resume, if I reload the page, I can see we have 2 sides, the left and the right. I'll go ahead and add a class name to the parent container. A margin top of 10. I will also give it a flex and make it flex wrap. On medium screen, I want the flex to be no wrap. and I want to give it a gap of 5. I will also give a class name to my left side, and in here I'm going to make the width full on smaller screen, and for medium and above I want it to be 2 seat of whatever the width is. I'll go ahead and define a similar class for our right side, but this time we don't want to pass anything, we just want it to occupy the space left after our left side space. Let's go into our left side and implement this component. In here, I'm going to import a picture and we will call it profile. I will clean this up and create another div. Inside this div, I will create my image and give it a class name. I will make it rounded and give it a weight full. I will also provide a source as our profile. And for alternative text, I will write a profile image. I will close this and save it. So we have our picture here. Also, I will create another div, and this is where I'll put our content. So I'll give an H4, and here I'll write my name. So assuming my name is Kayla Doe. And I will give this a class name and give it a margin bottom of 2. I'll write a P tag and write my title. So let's assume I'm a software engineer and I live in the UK. I'll give this a class name and give it a text style of secondary. For our class name, for our image, we can see there is no spacing, so let's go ahead and add a margin bottom of 2. Now we will go ahead and add our content. So I'll copy a text that I have which should briefly describe about me for my resume. Next, I'll create a new div. I'm going to import scales from our content. Let's use the map and get each scale. And for each scale, we will also get the index. I'm going to return a div. I'll pass the key as the index. And I'll render a tag span. In here, I'm going to render the scale. This will just be an array of scale set that we have. I'll add the closing div tag and save this. So we can see our scale sets here. Now I'll go ahead and give the container a class name. And I'll give it a background of secondary. I'll give it a padding vertical of 1 and a padding horizontal of 3. I'll make it a bit rounded and also give it an opacity of 90. Let's go ahead and separate this. So we will add a class name. And in here, I'm going to give it a flex and I'm making it item center. I'll give it a gap of 4 and give it flex wrap. So we have our content separated there. Next, we will give this a class name and we'll give the text small. So I'll go ahead and continue with the implementation. The next thing we want to do is we want to go into our index.css. We are going to add a generic style that we will use for each site. So I'll give this a resume base. That will be the name of the class. And I'm going to apply the following. I'll make it rounded medium. I'll give it a background of dark blue, a padding of 5, and I'll make it flex. I'll also give it a flex column and give a gap of 5. Next, I will use the end selector and get the H4 element, and I'm going to apply a text of extra large. So now in here, I'm going to add a class name here, and we will call it resume base. And if we save it, we have this. Now we will go ahead and create a similar container down here. Inside this container, we are going to add the following. We will add an h4 tag and we will call it about me. For the about me, I'll go ahead and paste some content that I have. So if I scroll down, this will be the about me section. Let's fix this. Next, I'll create another container and we'll give it the class name base. So the reason why we added it to our global class is so that we can reuse it and not redefine them every now and then. So I'll give our contact title and I'll be creating the following contact. So I'll create a container and I'll give this container a class name. I'll make it flex and give it a flex column. I'll also give it a gap of 3. Next, I'll create another div, and in this div, I'm going to render the following. The location, and let's say I live in London, UK. I'll give this a class name and I'll make this flex and I'll give this item center and I'll give this justify between. So we have our contacts. Let's go ahead and replicate this for our email. Let's say this is my email and my email is kaylado@gmail.com. So that would be my email. Next, I'll go ahead and create the last one, and let's say my phone, and I'll copy some random phone number. Let's save that. We will go ahead and implement our right side. So I'll clean this content, and in here I'm going to import the following. I will import these 3 icons, so the graduate cap, location, and the calendar, which we'll be using for the experiences and education. I also went ahead and imported our experiences and educations from the content that will be attached as the resource in this video. Now let's go ahead and create a div for our experiences. I'll go ahead and give this a class name of the same, base, and give it an h3 tag, and I'll call it experiences. Let's save that and scroll up so we have the experiences there. Next, I'll give it a div and I'll give this a class name and flex. I'll also make it flex column and give it a gap of 5. Inside this, I'll be rendering my experiences. So let's get the experience.map and get each experience and also its index. Now I'll create another div inside this and create the following. I'll first add a key as the index and give it the class name. For the class, I want its flex and items to be center. I want a gap of 10 and I want a background of this color. We want it rounded off large, and let me save it. Let's put some content in there. So we will add our image. We will give it the source, and in here we are going to say experiences.image. I'll give it a class name and give it the following. I'll make the width 10 and the height also 10. I'll give it rounded or full and give it an alternative name of company logo. Let's close this and see the changes. So we have all the experiences logos here. Next, we will go ahead and add the next content. So I'll make another div. And in this, I'm going to render an H4 element. I will render the experience title. And in here, I'm going to give it the following class name and give it a margin bottom of 1. Next, inside it, I'm going to render a span and I'll render the type of job I did, so either full-time or part-time. I'll give this a class name and give it the following. I'll make the text secondary, and also I'm going to wrap this around a bracket. So we have it here, and give it some spacing. Next, we are going to add another div. So let's go ahead and close this. And in this div, I'm going to render the following. So I'm going to make a p tag, and I'll use the CI location on. I'll give it a class name and give it an inline and give it a margin 2. I will close this and then render our experience dot location. Let's save that. Next, I'll give this a class. Next, I'm going to give this a class name and make it flex. I'll give it a gap of 6 and a margin bottom of 6. So I'll go ahead and replicate this, and I'm going to change this to our calendar. So regular calendar minus, and I'll save it. So we have our location and then we have our calendar. The last thing I would want to add is the description. So let's go ahead and do that. And that will be right after this content. I'll create a p tag and then put our experiences.description. So this will be our each experience and their description. We need some spacing around, so I'll go ahead and give this a padding of 4. And now we have some spacing around. I'll go ahead and copy this divider to create our education. So similar to our experiences, we are going to give it a title and we will say education. We will also give this a margin top of 10. Next, let's continue styling our education. So I'll give this a div and I'll go through each education with the map. I'll get the education, I'll get its index. Then I'm going to return a div. In here, I'm going to pass the key. It will be our index. So I'll give it a class name. I'll make it flex. And I'll give it item center. I'll give it a gap of 10. And I'll make the background the same. I'll also give it rounded large. And give it a padding of 4. So we have the education there. Let's go ahead and add the content. So the first is our image. I'll give it a source, and this will be our education.image. We will also give it a class name, and we'll give it a width of 10 and a height of 10. We'll make it rounded full. Next, we will give this alternative, and we will say education logo. Let's go ahead and close this and save. So we have our education or university tag images there. I'll go ahead and add a new div. And in here, I'm going to render our H4, and we will say education.degree. Let's save it, and I'll give it the following class, margin bottom of 1. Also, I'll create another div similar to our experiences and give this a class name and give the following class. I'll make it flex, give it a gap of 6 and a margin bottom of 6. Inside it, I'm going to render the P element, and I'll render our CI location on. I'll give it a class name and make it in line with the text. I'll give it a margin right of 2 and close it. Next, I'm going to render our location text. I'll copy this and make a small change. So in here, I'll do GI graduate, so the graduation cap, and we'll change this to the graduation date. So this is it for our resume. Before that, let's go ahead and add some spacing. So we will go ahead and add a class name here, and we'll give it a flex. We will also make it flex column, and we'll give it a gap of 5. Let's save that. So we have the spacing. And this will be all for our education. So we go home, and if we click on resume, we have this.